In the last chapter, we examined perfectly competitive markets. In this chapter, we're going to look at the exact opposite, a monopolistic market. Although monopolies rarely exist in the real world, the model of monopolies are useful to understand how an economy works and how firms that maybe aren't a full monopoly but are very close to a full monopoly, how they function. A monopoly is a firm that's the only seller of a good or service, and that good or service does not have a close substitute. So we study monopolies for two main reasons. Some firms are truly monopolists, so it's important to understand how they behave. Other firms might collude in order to act like a monopolist. So you have several firms in the same industry colluding. We can use the tools that we use to study monopolies to study those firms colluding as well. So, do monopolies really exist in the real world? Now, the textbook has you suppose you're in a small town with one pizzeria, but you don't really have to imagine that if you work at St. Francis, because that literally is the town of Loretto. So is the new pizza shop that opened up, and I don't know their name yet, is that pizzeria a monopoly? Well, first of all, it has other competition from other restaurants. It has competition from the LPG and from Spanky's. It also has competition from grocery stores that provide pizzas for you to cook at home. Think of Smith Myers. So whether or not you think the pizza place has a monopoly is whether if you consider these alternatives to be close substitutes for the pizzeria pizza. If getting food from the LPG or getting food from Smith Myers is a close enough substitute to getting that pizza from the pizza shop, then that pizza restaurant is not a monopoly. But if you think that the food you get at LPG or the food you would get at Smith Myers is not a close enough substitute for pizzeria pizza, if that fresh, nice, greasy pizza that you get at the pizza shop just offers something, it meets a need that frozen pizza or the fried food at LPG cannot meet, then in fact that pizza shop is a monopoly. Regardless of whether you believe it is a monopoly or if it's not a monopoly, the pizzeria's unique position as the only pizza shop in town may afford it some monopoly power, which will allow it to raise prices above marginal cost, like we did not see in the perfectly competitive market, and they can use that to obtain an economic profit and to keep that economic profit in the long run. For a firm to exist as a monopoly, there must be some barriers to entry, something that prevents other firms from coming in and competing with it. Remember, in perfectly competitive markets, there was free entry and exit. So any time that a firm saw a profit opportunity or saw that they were losing too much money in that market, they could enter or exit the industry. So what are some of the barriers to entry that we see for monopolies? Well, there's four key ones that we'll discuss in this chapter. The first is government restrictions on entry, which literally prevent consumers from entering the industry and beginning to compete. Next is the control of a key resource. After that is network externalities. And finally, natural monopoly. In the next several slides, we're going to explore these in much more detail. In the United States, the government blocks entry in two main ways. And the way we do it now is very different from the old days. So if you remember from history class, the British East India Company, the king would literally grant a charter of monopoly in returns from payment for that company. So fees, taxes, etc. We don't see this nowadays. The first and the main way that the government restricts entry is through patents and copyrights. Newly developed products, like pharmaceutical drugs, are frequently granted patents, and that's the exclusive right to produce a product for a period of 20 years from the date the patent is filed with the government. So it's granting property rights to a firm or an individual that patents it to prevent others from using that product or that design. This is done to encourage innovation. For instance, research and development for pharmaceutical drugs and for medical devices can take up to a decade, and we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. If other firms could immediately just copy that design, it wouldn't be worth it for firms to engage in all that research and development. So it would sort of be like a public good, where you have all the other firms trying to free ride on the other one's research and development. And at the end of the day, it would encourage no one to do research and development. So what the government tries to do is to allow firms to apply for a patent and have some period of monopoly so that they can recoup all the costs that they put into research and development. Then they open it up to competition from generics, from other other companies. There's also copyrights, and these provide the exclusive right to produce and to sell creative works. So these are things like books or films. So there's debate among economists about intellectual property. Some say it's good, some say we need longer protection, some say shorter protection, and a few in some certain areas say that we should have no protection. But patents and copyrights, the main purpose of them, and what I want you to remember, is that they encourage innovation and creativity. Because without them, firms would not be able to profit from their endeavors, from all the work it goes into creating those new products. The second way that the government restricts entry into an industry is through public franchises. So government designation that a firm is the only legal provider of a good or service is known as a public franchise. So these exist, for example, in electricity or water markets. So let's look at electricity supplier. So local government establishes one electricity supplier, and only one is able to provide electricity for that area. The belief is that competition would be too disruptive. So having too many wires, stringing them up and down the streets, having multiple power plants throughout town, that would be too much. You wouldn't get enough benefit from the competition to warrant all the additional costs and the high cost of adding new infrastructure. Sometimes, more commonly in Europe than the United States, governments even operate these firms as public enterprises. This is very rare in the United States, but one example of that is the United States Postal Service, which is operated by the federal government, but it's done differently than most other federal agencies. The next source of monopoly is the control of a key resource. For many years, the Aluminum Company of America, commonly called Alcoa, they either owned or had long-term contracts for almost all the world's supply of bauxite. That's the mineral from which we obtain aluminum. Control over a key resource served as a substantial barrier to entry for additional firms. It was too difficult to a firm to enter the industry because there was no way they could get a supply of bauxite to begin to make aluminum to compete against Alcoa. Because Alcoa either owned the bauxite mines or they had such a long-term contract that those mines could not sell to other producers. So because of this, because of their control over that resource, it ended up being a monopoly. No one could compete with them. Another example is the National Football League. They act as a monopoly in this manner as well. The way the NFL signs players to contracts, it ensures that the majority of the world's best football players are going to be under contract in the NFL, and they're unable to be used for any other potential leagues. So if you play in the NFL, you're not able to play in the XFL under a contract at the same time. That's a provision in the NFL contract. The most famous monopoly, based on the control of a raw resource, a raw material, is the De Beers diamond monopoly. De Beers sought to control as much of the supply of diamonds as possible so they could maintain high prices. Now this existed for, say, a century, but by 2000, new competitors had eroded De Beers' control of the world diamond production. This fell all the way down to about 40%, which would be extremely high for any other firm, but for De Beers, historically, that was extremely low. So in order to maintain their monopoly power, De Beers introduced the Forever Mark, which is a brand for its diamonds. Now this may not prove, to make them a true monopolist, but it is a way for them to differentiate their diamonds from other firms' diamonds. So what it does is provide them some market power, some monopoly power, because you can only get a Forever Mark diamond from De Beers. The third source of monopoly is network effects. Now, the idea behind network effects is that as more people use a good or a service, it becomes more useful. So network externalities are characteristic of a product in which its usefulness increases with the number of consumers who use it. It makes it more difficult for competitors to enter. Just ask Google+, who back almost been 8 years ago now, tried to compete with a new social network against Facebook. Because so many people were using Facebook and so few people were using Google+, you couldn't follow your friends, you couldn't follow celebrities on Google+. It was a much smaller group, so it wasn't as fun. Didn't allow you to do the same sort of things that Facebook allowed to. Facebook had these network externalities that Google Plus just could not overcome. These network externalities can set off a virtuous cycle for a firm, so allowing the value of its product to continue to increase along with the price it charges. But consumers may be locked into an inferior product, so there's always a concern about that. There's some examples historically, so auction sites like eBay, as more and more people offer their goods for sale on eBay and more people go to buy it on eBay, it's better to go to eBay than it is to go to a competitor. So eBay establishes market power and keeps increasing it the more people use it. There's also computer operating softwares like Windows, where the more people use Windows, the easier it is for IT to help you, or the more friends you can have help you, the more apps are created for it. It becomes more useful because so many more people are using it. The final source of monopoly is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly occurs when the economies of scale are so large that one firm can supply the entire market at a lower average total cost than can two or more firms competing. Natural monopolies are most likely when fixed costs are extremely high. So, for example, you have a firm producing electricity. That firm must make a substantial investment in production and distribution infrastructure. So to hang all the wires, to have all the transformers, to build the electricity producing plant itself. These are extremely expensive. But the marginal cost of producing another hour of electricity is low. So an already existing electricity producer can increase their production fairly cheaply. They can make a little bit more electricity if there's more people moving into town or greater demand. For a new firm to come and compete against them, it takes such a large upfront investment. That cost is too high, and it protects them. That barrier to entry is, it gives that existing producer monopoly power. So here we have a graph showing what happens with a natural monopoly. So in the market for electricity delivery, a single firm is point A. That can deliver electricity at lower cost. So the average total cost there is 4 cents. If you have two firms competing, each producing 15 billion units of electricity, they're going to be at point B. So the price or the cost per kilowatt hour in this case is going to be 6 cents instead of 4 cents. So those two firms competing are going to do it more expensive than if you just had one firm do it. So that's the source. That's why we see natural monopolies in some industries.